Hey guys, Dark Desert Highway here, and today we're going to talk about the many mistakes of Saul. Saul was the first king that was chosen and anointed to lead the Israelites. It was his job to be faithful and be obedient and listen to the words of the Lord that he was commanded and to carry them out. But what you'll see in Saul's life are many moments of failure to listen to the Lord's instruction. So let's go ahead and start. We're going to read a few chapters today, and we're going to highlight most of the mistakes of Saul. In 1 Samuel chapter 13, we're going to do 1 through 14. Saul was 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned 42 years over Israel. He chose 3,000 men from Israel for himself. 2,000 were with Saul at Michmash and in Bethel's hill country, and 1,000 were with Jonathan in Gibeah of Benjamin. He sent the rest of his troops away, each to his own tent. Jonathan attacked the Philistine garrison in Gibeah, and the Philistines heard about it. So Saul blew the ram's horn throughout all the land, saying, "Let the Hebrews hear." And all Israel heard the news. Saul has attacked the Philistine garrison, and Israel is now repulsive to the Philistines. Then the troops were summoned to join Saul at Gilgal. The Philistines also gathered to fight against Israel, 3,000 chariots, 6,000 horsemen, and troops as numerous as the sands on the seashore. Then he went up and camped at Michmash, east of Bethaven. The men of Israel saw that they were in trouble because the troops were in a difficult situation. They hid in caves, in thickets, among rocks, and in holes and cisterns. Some Hebrews even crossed the Jordan to the land of Gad and Gilead. Saul, however, was still at Gilgal, and all his troops were gripped with fear. He waited 7 days for the appointed time that Samuel had set, but Samuel didn't come to Gilgal, and the troops were deserting him. So he was supposed to wait for Samuel to offer the offering. But instead, this is where he makes his mistake. In verse 9. So Saul said, verse 8, he waited 7 days for the appointed time that Samuel had set. But Samuel didn't come to Gilgal, and the troops were deserting him. So Saul said, "Bring me the burnt offering and the fellowship offerings." Then he offered the burnt offering. Just as he finished offering the burnt offering, Samuel arrived. So Saul went out to greet him, and Samuel asked, "What have you done?" Saul answered, "When I saw that the troops were deserting me, and you didn't come within the appointed days, and the Philistines were gathering at Michmash, I thought, the Philistines will now descend on me at Gilgal, and I haven't sought the Lord's favor. So I forced myself to offer the burnt offering." Samuel said to Saul, "You have been foolish. You have not kept the command the Lord your God gave you. It was at this time that the Lord would have permanently established your reign over Israel. But now your reign will not endure. The Lord has found a man after his own heart, and the Lord has appointed him as ruler over his people because you have not done what the Lord commanded." So it didn't take much. It really didn't take much. He had clear instructions about what to do, and he got anxious seeing that his own people were abandoning him, facing such an enemy as this, the Philistines, they were a lot. They were a lot of men. 6,000 horsemen, 3,000 chariots, and troops as numerous as the sand on the seashore. So, yeah, the Philistines gathered around him, and his own men, the Israelites, the Hebrew nation, were hiding because of this great number of an army that came up against him. And Saul had clear instructions to wait for Samuel, but when he looked at the number of people, he was willing to go to war without the blessing. He was anxious. He was about to start, even though he was supposed to wait. Saul, however, was at Gilgal, and all his troops were gripped with fear. He waited 7 days to the appointed time that Samuel set, but Samuel didn't come to Gilgal, and the troops were deserting him. So Saul said, "Bring me the burnt offering and the fellowship offerings." Then he offered the burnt offering. And just as he finished offering the burnt offering, Samuel arrived. So Saul went out to greet him, and Samuel asked, "What have you done?" Saul answered, "When I saw that the troops were deserting me, and you didn't come within the appointed days, and the Philistines were gathering at Michmash, I thought," there he goes thinking, "the Philistines will now descend on me at Gilgal, and I haven't sought the Lord's favor." So the consequence was immediate. After his disobedience, Samuel said to Saul, "You've been foolish. You have not kept the command the Lord your God gave you. It was at this time the Lord would have permanently established your reign over Israel. But now your reign will not endure. The Lord has found a man after his own heart, and the Lord has appointed him as ruler over his people, because you have not done what the Lord commanded." But after this, Saul stays in the position of the king. He doesn't give up his position. Even though he knows that another man has been chosen, Saul continues to act in the office of the king until his death. And he pursues David, and because he learns that David is now the man who has been accepted by the Lord, who should rule over Israel. But Saul doesn't give up his kingship. He chases David. He even aligns with the enemy at some times to chase David all around the desert and all around Israel in order to slay him. So he's not being obedient. He begins to try to end the life of David on multiple times. Like he picked up a spear and threw it at David a couple times, and he pursued him with armies, and David just stayed, one step ahead of him. But we're not going to get into that story. We're going to look at the mistakes back to back that Saul has made. So let's go to chapter 15, 1 Samuel, chapter 15, 1 through 35. Samuel told Saul, "The Lord has sent me to anoint you as king over the people of Israel. Now listen to the words of the Lord. This is what the Lord of armies says. I have witnessed what the Amalekites did to the Israelites when they opposed them along the way as they were coming out of Egypt. Now, go and attack the Amalekites and completely destroy everything they have. Do not spare them. Kill men and women, infants and nursing babies, oxen and sheep, camels and donkeys." So that was the command. Then Saul summoned the troops and counted them at Telium, 200,000 foot soldiers and 10,000 men from Judah. Saul came to the city of Amalek and set up an ambush in the Wadi. He warned the Kenites, "Since you showed kindness to all the Israelites when they came out of Egypt, go on and leave. Get away from the Amalekites, or I'll sweep you away with them." So the Kenites withdrew from the Amalekites. Then Saul struck down the Amalekites from Havilah all the way to Shur, which is next to Egypt. He captured King Agag of Amalek alive. Wasn't supposed to do that. But he completely destroyed all the rest of the people with the sword. Saul and the troops spared Agag. Wasn't supposed to do that. And the best of the sheep, goats, cattle, and choice animals. That was not the instruction he received. As well as the young rams and the best of everything else. They were not willing to destroy them, but they did destroy all the worthless and unwanted things. Then the word of the Lord came to Samuel. I regret that I made Saul king, for he has turned away from following me and has not carried out all my instructions. So Samuel became angry and cried out to the Lord all night. So you can be chosen. You could be anointed and you could be appointed and still be disobedient. And the Lord can regret his election to office. I mean, look, you might be a pastor, you might run a church, you might be the head of the children's ministry, you might be in a prophet or a apostle. You could be somebody who has position. You could be anointed and appointed and still not do what's right. And then the Lord, in this situation, he regretted what he'd done. He regretted that he made Saul king. For he has turned away from following me and has not carried out my instructions. So Samuel became angry and cried out to the Lord all night. 12. Early in the morning, Samuel got up to confront Saul. But it was reported to Samuel, Saul went to Carmel, where he set up a monument for himself. Then he turned around and went down to Gilgal. When Samuel came to him, Saul said, May the Lord bless you. Like nothing's wrong. I have carried out the Lord's instructions. Samuel replied, Then what is the sound of sheep, goats, and cattle that I hear? Saul answered, The troops brought them from the Amalekites and spared the best sheep, goats, and cattle in order to offer a sacrifice to the Lord your God. But the rest we destroyed. Stop, exclaimed Samuel. Let me tell you what the Lord said to me last night. Tell me, he replied. Samuel continued, Although you once considered yourself unimportant, haven't you become the leader of the tribes of Israel? The Lord anointed you king over Israel, and then sent you on a mission and said, Go and completely destroy the sinful Amalekites. Fight against them until you have annihilated them. So why didn't you obey the Lord? Why did you rush on the plunder and do what was evil in the Lord's sight? But I did obey the Lord, Saul answered. I went on the mission the Lord gave me. I brought back King Agag of Amalek, and I completely destroyed the Amalekites. The troops took the sheep, goats, and cattle from the plunder, the best of what was set apart for destruction, to sacrifice to the Lord your God at Gilgal. So he's blaming the troops. He's shucking responsibility for this. In his own eyes, he was doing what he was supposed to do, but he wasn't. He's shifting the blame, and he's saying, we did it because we were going to sacrifice them to the Lord our God. Then Samuel said, 22, Does the Lord take pleasure in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as in obeying the Lord? Look, to obey is better than sacrifice. To pay attention is better than the fat of rams. For rebellion is like the sin of divination, and defiance is like wickedness and idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you as king. Saul answered Samuel and said, I have sinned. I have transgressed the Lord's command and your words, because I was afraid of the people. I obeyed the people. I obeyed them. Now, therefore, please forgive my sin and return with me so I can worship the Lord. Samuel replied to Saul, I will not return with you because you rejected the word of the Lord. The Lord has rejected you from being king over Israel. So you cross that line and it's over. It's done. It's done. You had your chance. Saul still had a life afterwards, but in the position that he was in the instruction that he had received, he had now been rejected. He stubbornly still keeps his position. Despite the Lord's rejection of him, he still prances around like a king. Nobody pushed him out. It was just the Lord and Samuel that were saying this. So nobody rose up against him and removed him from office. He still continued in the office that he was in. Even though another man had been appointed for the office, he got jealous of this other man, David, and went to go kill him to keep his office. So he's just making mistakes after mistakes. It's just the many failures of Saul in his life. So let's go back to 30. Saul said, I have sinned. Please honor me now. Oh, no, wait. 27. When Samuel turned to go, Saul grabbed the corner of his robe, and it tore. Samuel said to him, the Lord has torn the kingship of Israel away from you today, and has given it to your neighbor who is better than you. Furthermore, the Eternal One of Israel does not lie or change his mind, for he is not a man who changes his mind. So it's over. It's done for Saul. Saul said, I have sinned. Please honor me now before the elders of my people and before Israel. Come back with me so I can bow and worship to the Lord your God. Then Samuel went back following Saul, and Saul bowed down to the Lord. Samuel said, bring me King Agag of Amalek. Agag came to him trembling, for he thought, certainly the bitterness of death has come. Samuel declared, as your sword made women childless, so your mother will be childless among women. Then he hacked Agag to pieces before the Lord at Gilgal. Samuel went to Ramah, and Saul went up to his home in Gibeah of Saul. Even to the day of his death, Samuel never saw Saul again. Samuel mourned for Saul, and the Lord regretted that he had made Saul king over Israel. So just another thing. Let's go to 28. Chapter 28. Oh man, I really messed up there. 28, 1 through 25. So time had passed, and here is another story of another failure of Saul. At that time, the Philistines gathered their military units into one army to fight against Israel. So Achish said to David, you know, of course, that you and your men must march out in the army with me. David replied to Achish, good, you will find out what your servant can do. So Achish said to David, very well, I will appoint you as my permanent bodyguard. By this time, Samuel had died. So Samuel's dead, the prophet of the Lord, who had anointed Saul in the beginning of his reign over Israel. By this time, Samuel had died, and all Israel had mourned for him and buried him in Ramah, his city. And Saul had removed the mediums and the spiritists from the land. So there was no palm readers, there was no soothsayers, and those who communicate with demons in order to gain extra abilities, witchcraft basically. Saul had removed the mediums and the spiritists from the land. The Philistines gathered and camped at Shunem. So Saul gathered all Israel and camped at Gilboa. The Philistines gathered and camped at Shunem. Saul gathered all Israel and camped at Gilboa. So there's about to be another battle. When Saul saw the Philistine camp, he was afraid, and his heart pounded. He inquired of the Lord, but the Lord did not answer him in dreams or by the Urim or by the prophets. So at this point, his relationship is badly damaged between him and the Lord. The relationship has taken on a place to where the Lord is not even going to answer him. He's so done with Saul. He's so done with the disobedience. I mean, Saul kept the kingship, even though he was removed from office. Another man was appointed, and instead of bowing out of the position and being like, you know what, I messed up, he kept his rule over Israel and sought to end the life of David, even though David didn't do anything wrong against him. And then David, even though he had opportunity to kill Saul, wouldn't touch Saul, and the whole story along with that. But by this time, the Lord was done with Saul and his disobedience. And it had created a big rift in the relationship, because he continued to do whatever he felt like he wanted to do instead of humbling himself before the Lord and obeying. He messed up. He messed up, and it was done. The kingdom had been taken away from him. But he just kept messing up. So he knew the consequence of the behavior that he had, the way that he obeyed or disobeyed the Lord's instruction, but he continued. Instead of being like, woe is me, you're right, I completely screwed up, let me save the rest of my life with some face, right? Let me save some face and just be the guy who blew it once. But he wasn't. He kept on blowing it and kept on blowing it. So by this time, the Lord isn't even answering him through prophets, through the Urim, or in dreams. The Lord's not even speaking to him. So Saul said to his servants in verse 7, "Find me a woman who is a medium so I can go and consult her." His servants replied, "There is a woman in Endor who is a medium." Saul disguised himself by putting on different clothes and set out with two of his men. They came to the woman at night, and Saul said, "Consult a spirit for me. Bring up for me the one I tell you." But the woman said to him, "You surely know what Saul has done, how he has cut off the mediums and spiritists from the land. Why are you setting a trap for me to get killed?" And then Saul swore to her by the Lord, "As surely as the Lord lives, no punishment will come to you from this." "Who is it that you want me to bring up for you?" the woman asked. "Bring up Samuel for me," he said. When the woman saw Samuel, she screamed, and then she asked Saul, "Why did you deceive me? You are Saul." But the king said to her, "Don't be afraid. What do you see?" "I see a spirit form coming up out of the earth," the woman answered. Then Saul asked her, "What does he look like?" "An old man is coming up," she replied. "He's wearing a robe." Then Saul knew that it was Samuel, and he knelt low with his face to the ground and paid homage. So now, because he can't get a word from the Lord, listen to this, he goes to demons. He goes to a spiritist who practices a relationship with demons in order to bring up Samuel, in order to get some answer to his question. So in the face, in realizing that the Lord isn't going to speak to me, I'm now going to go to demons to get the answer that I want. "Why have you disturbed me by bringing me up?" Samuel said to Saul. "I'm in serious trouble," replied Saul. "The Philistines are fighting against me, and God has turned away from me. He doesn't answer me anymore, either through the prophets or dreams, So I've called on you to tell me what I should do." Samuel answered, "Since the Lord has turned away from you and has become your enemy, why are you asking me? The Lord has done exactly what he said through me. The Lord has torn the kingship out of your hand and given it to your neighbor David. You did not obey the Lord and did not carry out his burning anger against Amalek. Therefore, the Lord has done this to you today. The Lord will also hand Israel over to the Philistines along with you, and tomorrow you and your sons will be with me. And the Lord will hand Israel's army over to the Philistines." Whew, harsh. Immediately, Saul fell flat on the ground. He was terrified by Samuel's words and was also weak because he had not eaten anything all day and all night. The woman came over to Saul, and she saw that he was terrified and said to him, "Look, your servant has obeyed you. I took my life in my hands and did what you told me to do. Now please listen to your servant. Let me set some food in front of you. Eat it. It will give you strength so that you can go on your way." He refused, saying, "I won't eat." But when his servants and the woman urged him, he listened to them. He got up off the ground and sat on the bed. The woman had a fattened calf at her house. She quickly slaughtered it. She took also flour and kneaded it and baked unleavened bread. She served it to Saul and his servants, and they ate. Afterwards, they got up and left that night. Now comes time for the death of Saul. A life of disobedience, and his death is fulfilled after what Samuel had prophesied when he went to a spiritist to basically talk to demons because the Lord wasn't answering him. 31, 1 through 13. The Philistines fought against Israel, and Israel's men fled from them and were killed on Mount Gilboa. The Philistines pursued Saul and his sons and killed his sons, Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua. When the battle intensified against Saul, the archers found him and severely wounded him. Then Saul said to his armor-bearer, "Draw your sword and run me through with it, or these uncircumcised men will come and run me through and torture me." But his armor-bearer would not do it because he was terrified. Then Saul took his sword and fell on it. When his armor-bearer saw that Saul was dead, he also fell on his own sword and died with him. So on that day, Saul died together with his 3 sons, his armor-bearer, and all his men. When the men of Israel on the other side of the valley and on the other side of Jordan saw that Israel's men had fled and that Saul and his sons were dead, they abandoned the cities and fled. So the Philistines came and settled in them. The next day, when the Philistines came to strip the slain, they found Saul and his 3 sons dead on Mount Gilboa. They cut off Saul's head, stripped him of his armor, and sent messengers throughout the land of the Philistines to spread the good news. In the temple of their idols and among the people, then they put his armor, to spread the good news in the temples of their idols and among the people. Then they put the armor in the temple of the Ashtoreth and hung his body on the wall of Bethshan. When the residents of Jabesh Gilead heard what the Philistines had done to Saul, all their brave men set out, journeyed all night, and retrieved the body of Saul and the body of his sons from the wall of Bethshan. When they arrived at Jabesh, they burned the bodies there. Afterward, they took their bones and buried them under the tamarisk tree in Jabesh and fasted for 7 days. So, it makes me feel like, you're looking back on my life, I've blown it. I've completely blown it. But you got to come to a place where, despite all the evil things that I have done, I will finally humble myself before the Lord. Now, I might have blown it and lost out on something great. because I was disobedient and ignorant and foolish and stupid and opened my mouth, and just corruption came out of me. When you have a great opportunity to be appointed to a position in regarding the things of the Lord, like church or something else, missionary, ministry, we have to submit ourselves to the Lord. We have to follow instruction. We have to humble ourselves, and we have to do what we're instructed to do in order to fulfill what God wants for us and for his people. So those were the many faults of Saul. And I look at Saul's life, and you can learn, because the Bible has somebody who completely just blew it. So let's learn from him. And when we get an opportunity to do something for the Lord, or we're appointed to a position, let's fulfill that position with our whole heart and be obedient. And that's it for today. So I'll see you next time.